Good evening. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's great to be with you. Our timer is working, and it's even a little improved from yesterday. Great to see James Roth in the house saying shalom from Indianapolis. Stephen Giguere is saying shalom from Dover, New Hampshire. Bill Eldridge is in the house from Berkeley. Christo Cheney says shalom again from Lubbock, Texas. Tammy Lynn Garrison says hello from central Pennsylvania. Yehudit Sobel is in the house saying shalom from Florence, South Carolina. And Deborah Hazelwood is over on the YouTube side checking in from Florida. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago. Alan Fox from Wisconsin. Jackson Stiles says shalom from Greensboro, North Carolina. Yesterday, there was a little bit of a misunderstanding. When we're live, and if you tune in, you just pick up where we are. But sometimes if it's toward the end of the show and you find this and you tune in, you might be starting from the beginning of the video. And so if you're, putting in the comments where you're from, I might have already ended the video and I don't see it, even though it says live on your screen. So today we started at just about exactly 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. So that is our actual start time. All right. Joe Manich, I'm not sure, from Pittsburgh. Fred Sclafani says hi. Alexander Benedict Dougherty says, hey, yo, from Philly. Rajans Tiwari is asking, what is this? Stay with us and you'll see. Rochelle Rosen in the house from Modesto. This is awesome. A lot of people with us. Brandon is in from Knoxville. Lauren Greenstein from Peachtree Corners, Georgia. And Rajans Tiwari, what you're going to see is that this is a class in the Talmud, the oral tradition in Judaism. All right, my friends, let us light up the darkness. All right. We are holding on Daf Kuf Yud Hey. That's page 115 of Tractate Shabbos, the second volume of the Talmud. Today we're starting chapter 16, discussing Mishnah number 1. This whole chapter is going to be about one big question. What do you do if a fire breaks out on Shabbos? As you can imagine, it's a problem because one of the first things we learned is that we don't kindle a flame on Shabbos and we don't extinguish a flame on Shabbos. So to put out a fire is just, it's going to encounter severe difficulties. We also don't carry on Shabbos. Particularly, we don't carry something from one domain to another, from a private domain to a public domain. And there are certain things which are muktzah, meaning that they have no purpose, no use on Shabbos. They're things that we use during the week for our work. And on Shabbos, they have no place, so we don't even touch those things. So now if a fire breaks out, God forbid, in our home on Shabbos, what are we going to do? A person is, first of all, in that situation is going to be panicked, is going to be totally stressed out, is going to instinctively, as long as they can save their lives, right? That's the main thing, obviously, to save life. And as we say over and over and over again, no matter what the laws of Shabbos are, to save a life, we do whatever is necessary. Of course, we desecrate Shabbos to save a life. The question is about saving property. Anyone who's had the awful experience of going through a fire is going to know that safety is the main thing. And the last thing you want to do is run into a burning building to get stuff, to save things. It's just way too dangerous. But if the fire is not that big and it's possible to save property, so then we run into these difficulties having to do with the laws of Shabbos. Now, the general rule we're going to start to define when we get to page 117 in 2 days. But what's interesting is that, and the general rule is like mostly you cannot save your stuff. Mostly you cannot save things. You can't violate Shabbos just to save property. Now, while that's the general rule with tons of exceptions and nuances, as we'll see, instead of starting with the general rule, our sages are going to begin with the exception. Perhaps it's because this is such an uncomfortable and counter-instinctive rule, right? I mean, particularly if you think in the ancient world where, I mean, people were they were poor. You know, there were so many poor people. I mean, there's poor people now, but they had fewer things. And the things that they had were very dear to them. They really would want to save things from a fire. And so it's really going to cut against a person's instinct when we're going to tell them that, you know, generally you can't save your property, and why we say that. But instead of starting there, our sages are going to open this discussion here with the first Mishnah with the exception to the rule, the things we can save. And specifically, Scripture. Books of Scripture, holy books, can be saved. What's the general reason? Because they had the names of God in them, right? And we do not want in any way something containing a name of God to be desecrated, even destroyed. So there's going to be an exception for that general rule because we're going to save books of Scripture. Here's the Mishnah. With regard to all sacred writings, one may rescue them from the fire on Shabbos, whether they are read in public or whether they are not read in public. And this we're going to define momentarily. And this ruling applies even though they were written in any foreign language. According to the rabbis, those scrolls are not read in public, but they are still sacred and require burial. And why does one not read the writings on Shabbat? This we're going to explain in a minute. Why are certain books that are in Hebrew and that are part of Scripture nevertheless not read publicly on Shabbos? Due to suspension of Torah study in the study hall. All right, so let's unpack the Mishnah so we understand what is being said here. So first of all, we talk about we're going to save holy books. We're going to save books of Scripture from a fire on Shabbos, whether they are read in public or whether they are not read in public. What is read in public? Okay, so if, Brian, could you go in the house and get the Tanakh? Just ask, Nina will probably have it because she's listening, but please bring the Tanakh. So Brian's going to bring that in a moment. And, okay, but a Tanakh is a Hebrew Bible. We call it a Tanakh, which is actually an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, and Kesuvim. Torah is Torah, so that meaning the first 5 books of the Bible, the 5 books of Moses is how they're commonly called. And toward the end of today's class, we're going to discover that what we think is 5 books is actually 7 books. We'll get to that a little later. But the 5 books of the Torah are often called the Torah. The word Torah can actually refer to all of Scripture and all of sacred teaching, including both the written law and the oral law. The word Torah means teaching, the teaching. But when we use it in this sense, that we generally mean the first 5 books. Thank you, Brian. So this is a Hebrew Bible, okay? And as you can see, it's called a Tanakh. So the T is for Torah. The N in the middle is for Nevi'im, meaning prophets, right? So when we talk about the prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Zechariah, Daniel, etc., the prophets, right? That's the prophets. And then the last, the Ch here is a Chaf, which stands for Kesuvim, right? A Kaf. So that's the Kesuvim, meaning the writings. And the writings include Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. I'm not sure if Lamentations falls. Probably Lamentations is along with, which is written by Jeremiah, falls along with the prophets. But at any rate, those are the 3 basic categories of biblical books in the Hebrew Bible: the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Now, the Torah, of course, is read publicly. We read the whole Torah portion every Shabbos, and we read a portion of the week's Torah portion on Mondays and Thursdays. So obviously Torah is read publicly. On Shabbos, During the morning service, when we get to the Torah service, we divide that week's Torah portion basically into 7 readings plus a little bonus at the end called the Maftir. And so we read the Torah portion. And then we read aloud in synagogue something called the Haftorah, which is an excerpt from the prophets, from Nevi'im. And so you'll see, when they read the Haftorah, it could be from the book of Samuel, it could be from the book of Isaiah, from the book of Jeremiah, etc. Malachi is one that we read as Passover approaches, from the prophets. What we don't read aloud in synagogue as part of the formal readings, part of the services, is from the writings. Now, obviously, Psalms is a huge part of our prayer services. And we recite Psalms, and it's part of the prayer book, and we even sing Psalms. But in terms of this idea of public reading, a formalized public reading, we don't do that from the writings. In ancient times, there was just much less to read. And there was much less to read and to talk about. No internet, no bookstores. Only rich people really had access to books. So the writings were considered almost like pop, almost like pop literature. The writings were thought to be the more interesting parts of the Torah because they were covered less in synagogue, and there was so much of it, and it was all really interesting and had a different kind of tone than the Torah and the prophets. And people were into it. They were into reading from the books of the writings. But the sages were trying to establish a schedule where they would go to services in the morning. Most people didn't go to synagogue except on Shabbat because it was hard for them to get it. There weren't so many synagogues. It was more difficult. So they would come and spend most of the day in synagogue on Shabbos. And what they were learning about in the afternoon, which the sages considered very important, is halacha, meaning the law. There were classes being given to people in the law, so they would know what they can cook and what they can't cook and how to observe Shabbos and how to write contracts and all of the things that one needs to know in order to be an educated Jew who can fulfill his obligations and avoid violating Torah prohibitions. And so the writings, at that time, it's not like there was something wrong with them or they were banned. They simply weren't read in public because it didn't fit in the Saturday schedule, as it were. So that's what's read and what's not read, right? Torah and prophets are read in synagogue. The writings are not read aloud publicly in synagogue, particularly in ancient times that we're talking about. Then the issue comes up about translation. Now today, it's the most common thing to see holy books, books of the Bible, books of the Talmud, books of commentary. Your Jewish library, your faith library, as it were, could be vast, huge. But we're very lucky. We're privileged that we live in a time when books are so available and so affordable. Back then, this was not the case. And most Jews were educated enough that they could follow the Hebrew. The common language was Aramaic, but Aramaic has a lot of similarities to Hebrew, so it wasn't so difficult for people to follow the Hebrew. So at that time, it was not permitted to translate books into other languages. It was understood to demean the meaning of Scripture, that so much would get lost when it got translated from the Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue, to the common tongue, right? Just other languages, that it was understood to somehow desecrate the text of Scripture if it was translated into other languages. The door sort of cracked open, surprisingly, not with Aramaic, but with Greek. Greek became such an important language, during the heyday of the Hellenistic Empire, the Greek Empire. That there were a few authorized translations made into Greek that were so carefully done that they had some authority and they were considered sacred. But there were the sort of loose translations, not the authorized translations, the just man on the street translations into Aramaic or Coptic or other languages were thought to be problematic. The issue we're going to see here in a debate between Rav Huna and Rav Chisda is that, well, the translations may not have been perfect, but what's being translated is scripture. So if we're saying that we're going to save books of scripture from a fire, are we going to say we're not going to save it if it's translated into another language? So let's see how this debate plays out. The debate is between Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. Rav Huna is going to say that we may not save books of scripture written in other languages from a fire. And Rav Chisda is going to say that we can. Huna is going to say, what may be read? Right? He's going to now go back at the Mishnah and go through it. Right? What may be read? Well, this is the Torah and the Nevi'im, the Torah and the prophets. What may not be read? The Kesuvim, the writings. But the writings are in Hebrew. They're obviously very holy. We just don't read them aloud in synagogue at that time. So they would certainly be rescued from a fire, even though they were not read aloud in shul. But according to Rav Huna, what is not read and not rescued? These unauthorized translations of scripture into other languages. Rav Chisda says, what is read? Torah and Nevi'im. He agrees with Rav Huna there. What is not read? Kesuvim, the writings, they are not read, but they are certainly rescued. And according to Rav Chisda, likewise, these translated works are not read aloud in synagogue, not publicly, but they would be rescued even though they are in other languages. And where they both agree is that even Rav Huna would say that a work of scripture that is translated into another language, we may not violate Shabbos to rescue it from a fire, but we still will treat that book with respect. And so, like when it reaches the end of its life, because it's worn out, a lot of people have read it, pages are falling out, etc., we wouldn't just throw it in the trash. We need to bury it. And so here we have the concept of a geniza. A geniza is a burial place for Jewish works of scripture. Works of scripture do not get thrown in the garbage and do not get burned, because we will not burn. It's prohibited to burn God's name. So when an old prayer book or an old Torah, when the book is just so falling apart that you can't use it anymore, or even some would say, when you receive a handout at a lecture that has God's name written on it, it's a problem because God's name is written on it. What do you do with it? That shouldn't just go in the trash. It shouldn't get recycled. So, people who are more particular about this, and certainly when we're talking about scrolls written on parchment, when they reach the end of their life, these objects have to go into a geniza. And so you have some people will have a temporary geniza. I have a box up there just of, all kinds of things that come across my desk that happen to be printouts or, sheets or old books or whatever. And I just keep them in there. And then at some point when it's full and I just can't store that much stuff anymore, I'll talk to a local synagogue. And so, the local synagogues, one of them at some point will be taking a whole bunch of these kinds of materials to a special place where they get buried in the ground. And so Rav Huna would agree that even these unauthorized translations into other languages, when they reach the end of their useful life, will be buried and not just discarded or destroyed. Interestingly, at the time that Rav Huna and Rav Chisda are having this argument, the oral law was very much the oral law. The Mishnah gets set down in the year 200 of the Common Era. It gets formalized and it's written here and there. But beyond that, the Gemara certainly had not been written down yet. And people who were writing, like basically prayer books didn't exist yet, right? And so people who were writing lists of blessings or amulets is a separate thing. But basically speaking, especially in the Second Temple period, you can't write down the oral law, right? And before the Mishnah is set down in the year 200, there's a lot of activity among the sages, between in the late Second Temple period, before the temple falls, in the year 69, and then from the year 69 until the year 200, when the Mishnah gets set down. There's a lot of activity among the sages, and all of it is done orally. I mean, when we talk about our sages and say that these men are geniuses, towering geniuses, there's a reason for that. They had the whole oral law memorized. And along with it, they basically had scripture memorized. The whole Bible they had memorized. And so all these teachings that we're covering, in our vast edition of the Talmud, I mean, the Mishnah, for sure, they had it all memorized. Eventually, people had the whole Gemara memorized. And so the oral law was meant to be memorized and discussed and discussed and taught and discussed and taught and argued and passionately debated. But it was an oral tradition. It wasn't written down. If somebody did write it down, so he was doing something that was prohibited. And because it was prohibited, it was understood to be tantamount to burning the name of God. Because then the question would come up, if you sinned, which to them it was a sin, later obviously that changed, but to them it was a sin to write down the oral tradition. So if you did write it down, are you going to save that from a fire? On the one hand, well, what you wrote, might be blessings that are being, sort of recorded and set up and learned and understood to become part of the daily prayers. So that's going to have God's name all over it. Are you going to let that burn? Or are you going to, violate Shabbos to save something that never should have been written in the first place? That was the conflict. Of course, now the halakha is different. Of course, we have books. Of course, the whole oral tradition is now written in books. And of course, we save translations and prayer books and books of the Talmud and all the books of commentary on scripture and on the oral law, etc. Now, you would, if you could, save your whole, Jewish library, books that have names of God, etc., from a fire. But back then, they didn't. And there was actually an incident where Rabbi Yishmael was told that a man was writing blessings down rather than just learning to memorize them. So Rabbi Yishmael went to investigate. And when he got close to the man's house and was walking up the stairs, the man heard someone coming. He knew he was doing something that was prohibited. And so he took his pages, or his pieces of paper with the blessings written on them, and he just shoved it into a bowl of water, to hide it from his visitor. Rabbi Yishmael came in, saw what the man had done, and he said, worse than writing the blessings down is that you destroyed God's name by sticking those blessings in a bowl of water. It's bad that you violated a prohibition. It is worse that you destroyed God's name. And, this is one of those cases, right, where the cover-up is worse than the crime. Finally, on this page, we learn that if a scroll is old and decayed, do we save it? So the question is, how old and how decayed is that scroll? And the answer is, well, if it has 85, first of all, it has God's name in it, we save it. But if it doesn't have God's name in it, like imagine a scroll, that let's say it's a book of Isaiah, and it's like really old and like all the writing on it is worn out. But if you can make out 85 letters, not just one letter here and there, but whole words where their letters add up to 85 letters, so then there's enough there for you to consider it a book, and therefore it's worth saving, right? If it has less than 85 intelligible letters in the book, then it's so old and decayed that it's like it's already not a book anymore, and therefore you wouldn't save it from the fire. Why 85 letters? So that comes from the book of Numbers, or in Hebrew, Bamidbar, chapter 10, verses, where is it? Verses 35 and 36. We actually just had that recently in our yearly cycle. And the the verse is here. It's just 85 letters long. It says, and it's part of our prayer book whenever we have a Torah service. We say, whenever the ark set out, Moses would say, "Arise, O Lord, and your enemies will be dispersed, and your foes will flee before you. For from Zion shall go forth the Torah, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Blessed is he who in his holiness gave the Torah to his people Israel." Right? So that's Numbers 10, 35, and 36. It's 85 letters long. What is special about this little, 2 verses that we're going to say, 85 letters like those 2 verses constitutes a book? And the reason is because those 2 verses are understood by our sages to constitute a book. They're in the middle of the book of Numbers, right, which is the 4th book of the Torah. And these verses, let me see if I can, this image is a little dark, so I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see it. So that is an image of a Torah scroll. And if you look, that verse, which I just read, is separated. And it's separated from the text that comes before and the text that comes after by 2 letters. It's actually the same letter twice. And it's the Hebrew letter Nun. The Hebrew letter Nun. And it's upside down. So I'm sorry that was a little bit out of focus. But at any rate, if you look in the Torah, and in fact, even in a Tanakh, which is not the image of a scroll, the way we read it in synagogue, a parchment scroll, nevertheless, I'm sure we'll find that the verse is set aside by the 2 nuns. Is it not? Yes, it is. So you can see it right here, right there. So the 85 letters of that phrase, there we go, are set aside by those 2 nuns, upside down, before and after. So that phrase, for a couple of different reasons, and we're going to discuss it more tomorrow, actually, on tomorrow's daf, it's sort of set aside. It's a little bit, the chronology is off, like it should have happened earlier in the Torah, and it gets moved into this spot in order to sort of, not have too many painful descriptions of our transgressions in the desert when we were just so difficult for Moses to lead. But at any rate, those 2 verses are set aside, and so our sages will actually say that the books of the Torah are not 5, but 7. The book of Genesis, the book of Exodus, the book of Leviticus, then the first part of the book of Numbers, before those 2 verses, then the 2 verses themselves are their own book, then the rest of the book of Numbers after those 2 verses, and then the book of Deuteronomy. So we all assume that there's 5 books of the Torah, but if you count like this, it's actually 7 books. And the 2 verses between those 2 nuns are considered their own book. And it's a very special phrase, and we use it every time we introduce a Torah service in synagogue. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let me see what questions or comments you've got for me. Okay, Monica Critchlow says, saving a livelihood may save lives. Right, so there, right away, you cut right to the chase of why it's going to be so against a person's instinct that, God forbid, there's a fire in their house and they can't put out the fire and they can't save their property. And you're right, I mean, they could lose their entire livelihood. This is going to be a very, very difficult body of law that we're going to be studying. There's nothing easy about it. Sharon Frant Brooks says Echa is part of Kesuvim along with the other Megillot. Thank you. So she's saying that that Lamentations, Echa, is considered part of the writings, even though it's written by a prophet. It's written by Jeremiah, but it's considered part of the writings. along with the other Megillot. So these are the ones that we read on certain holidays, like the Book of Esther is a Megillah that we read at Purim, and the Book of Ruth is a Megillah that we read at Shavuos. And these are both writings. It is like the two Megillahs by Solomon are also in Kesuvim. So the books by Solomon are Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, and those are part of the writings rather than the prophets. Caroline Dobson Chavez, have you ever studied Aramaic? I have not, but it's because I'm reading and teaching to you the Talmud in English. But the Mishnah, every time we study a Mishnah, that's in Hebrew. The Gemaras that our sages were arguing and debating what the Mishnahs mean, that is mostly in Aramaic. They'll slip into Hebrew every time they quote a verse from Scripture, and of course, everything that the sages teach and decree and rule on is based in Scripture. So they're constantly citing Scripture in Hebrew, but their arguments are in Aramaic. I need to get my Hebrew stronger before I can go off and study Aramaic. But the languages are similar, right? So somebody who's a really good Hebrew speaker can pick up Aramaic relatively quickly. Bill Eldridge first ran into this concept, a tomb for books, speaking about the Geniza, in my teens in the fiction of Sir Terry Pratchett. It was moving then, and it's even more so now. Christo Cheney, I have a temporary Geniza in my apartment where some Sidurim and Maksurim are stored for now until they get buried. Exactly, just like me. Things that you no longer can use, but you're going to treat them with great respect, like a temporary Geniza, until they can be buried permanently. Brandon says, in regard to translations, which English translation of the Bible do you find to be most accurate? I've been enjoying Robert Alter's Hebrew Bible. Alter is terrific. Edward Fox is also terrific. I find that, these days, just like when you're trying to get the news about what's going on in politics around the country, no matter what your preferred source is, if you only read one source, you're not getting the news. Likewise, if you don't, if you haven't merited, right, to be somebody who grew up with like a great Hebrew education and can really get all the nuance out of the Hebrew, and I wish I was that guy and I'm not. Every day I learn a little more. My Hebrew's gotten better, but it's still, I can only characterize it as weak. So my English, of course, is much stronger. I mean, I was an English literature major in college. I'm a professional writer. I take language very seriously, and I take Scripture very seriously. So anytime I'm studying a verse or I'm studying a teaching, I'm going to get into multiple translations. And it's only by getting into more than one translation that you can start to see what it was that the translator was wrestling with and what choices he made. So the simplest thing that's available are going to be the translations at Chabad. Chabad has all of Scripture available. And Sepharia.org. So those are two online sources, of Hebrew Scripture translated into English effectively. Now, I'm going to be honest with you and just tell you what I think. There's many other translations of Hebrew Scripture that are basically being created by people from other religious traditions. And, they have an agenda related to their own religious tradition. So when you go to study Hebrew Scripture, if you're getting a translation from a religion and a tradition that's not Judaism, there's just, because I've used it many times. I've gone to Bible Hub, I've looked at their translations and, the Revised Standard Version and the New Standard Version and, all these other kinds of translations. And their agenda is just different than the Jewish agenda. And the translations lose a lot. So I recommend that if you're studying Hebrew Scripture, to get at the original intent, to get at what the laws were, that God was telling Moses to teach the Jews. Because let's face it, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, what the culture would call the Old Testament, is by, for, and about the Jews. Well, it's by God, but it's written by his servant Moses for the Jews to teach them how to live their lives. So, to understand what's going on in there, you really need a translation that's coming from a Jewish perspective. That's very important. Okay. Christo Cheney, Brandon, I love the Altar Bible. I also use the Koran, Jerusalem Bible, Orthodox, and the JPS Tanakh Reform. So the JPS has a lot to do in Sepharia. Art Scroll is this Tanakh that I'm showing you. This is the Art Scroll. Art Scroll is just beautiful. Art Scroll does not put out a book without investing huge resources to get the translation and the commentary correct. And the same goes for Koran. So if you're talking about like books in print, please God, you can and you do. I just said for online resources, Sepharia and Chabad. But when you're talking about books, get the Fox, get the Altar, get Art Scroll, get Koran. These are great places to start. And even within Art Scroll, you'll see that things change depending on which edition. If you're talking about the stone Chumash, or you're talking about the interlinear Chumash with Rashi. The interlinear Bibles are terrific. There you're going to get a word by word translation. I don't have one in here. Maybe Brian, if you could go inside and get an interlinear, one of the editions of the interlinear translation. And there are prayer books that are interlinear too. And there what you have is an English translation of every word. And often Hebrew words sort of carry the preposition and the object. And so it'll take 2, sometimes as many as 5 English words to translate one Hebrew word. And having that kind of a resource in front of you is the best to develop your understanding of Scripture as it was originally intended to be read. And I'll show you that in a moment. Okay, Sharon Frank Brooks. Many shuls bury these books and documents with holy people when they are interred. Beautiful. That's a great way to make sure that they're buried with all the respect due to books that contain the names of God. I have remnants of holy books saved by a righteous Gentile from the Beis Midrash in my dad's shtetl when the Nazis burned down the Beis Midrash. So the Beis Midrash is the house of study, right, where people would study, Scripture all day long or whenever they could, when they would, before work or after work, and the people who, were fortunate enough that they could study all day. So that was the Beis Midrash. And they were just, every Jewish community in ancient Europe had one or many Beis Midrashes filled with holy books. Then the Holocaust came, and Sharon is talking about there were definitely people in many of these communities, righteous Gentiles who understood, thank you so much, who understood, what was being lost and what was being destroyed, and that these books, were Scripture. Anybody who loves God and loves Scripture understands that these books, they can't be desecrated. And so it's quite heroic, these people who defied the will of the Nazis to save these books. So the person who saved that from the shtetl of Sharon's, where Sharon's dad is from, wow, shkoyach to him, may his memory always be for a blessing. Christo Cheney says, I love how the Koran Talmud has the entire Vilna text with vowels in the Hebrew and Aramaic, unlike my Sonsino Talmud. So what Christo's talking about here is in the Koran Talmud, right? So when you're reading along, you're reading in English like this, and the Hebrew is mixed in or right next door to the English. But in the back, you have the Vilna layout. This is what a page of Talmud looks like to people who don't need English translations. The way that that the Art Scroll Talmud does it is every page is right there. There's the Talmud page, and you see this little gray bar down here. That tells you that it's only these lines across the bottom here which have then been translated on this side. And so that's why it'll take, and then the gray bar is here for all of that, right? And then it's at the top. So all of this translates this part, all of this translates this part, and this third page translates this last little part. But what the Art Scroll offers is all these footnotes. So for people who are wondering, what the difference is between the Art Scroll Talmud and the Koran Talmud, it's great for newbies. It really makes everything so clear. It's basically one commentary, though. It's the commentary of Rav Aden Steinsaltz. He brings down other commentaries, but he's the one who's really teaching it to you. And then what it offers, it's great, is these explanatory notes and what things are and images of things that were used in Talmudic times. And where they're debating the law, it offers the halacha, meaning, well, they debated, this sage said that, and that sage said this, and they argued, and then other people argued, and other people argued. Well, what did the law end up being? And so he always has the halacha. What the Art Scroll offers is many commentaries, right? Many people are brought down, many things are explained. It's a much broader look at the history of commentary on the oral law in the Art Scroll Talmud. So, if you're rich and you can afford it, and you're lucky. I was very fortunate that Koren gifted me the Koren Talmud. When I went through my first journey through Daf Yomi, I invested and bought the Art Scroll Talmud. But ideally, you would have both. Ideally, you would have both. And then still, you're going to, look up things in other books. And then when I was talking about an interlinear translation, this is a Shabbos sitter, but Art Scroll does a beautiful job with these, and you can get the Bible this way too. And as you can see, every word in the line, every Hebrew word, has its English translation right below. And so this is a beautiful way to increase your knowledge of Hebrew and to really get at the meanings of the texts that you are studying. Okay, Rochelle Rosen says, we buried books when we buried my father of blessed memory. So there you go. So Rochelle actually had that experience. And Rochelle, may your dad's memory always be for a blessing. And thank you for sharing that. Lucy Ram Johnson says, do you like the Jewish Study Bible? I've looked at it. I just find that when I looked at it, it seemed a little bit superficial to me. But there's a lot of wonderful stuff in there, So as one book in the library, great. But you want to build that library. Because every time you have a question and you want to dig a little deeper, you want to have more places to go. And especially on Shabbos, when you can open your books, but you can't go online. Olga Harbin says, is it ever okay to donate a Tanakh? Of course it's okay. Sure, because it's going to be used. Absolutely, it's okay. You're saying an old one rather than throwing it away, that you want to donate it. Sure, but you want to donate, make sure it gets a good home. That's all I would say. Make sure it gets a good home. And James Roth says, I just ordered the Art Scroll Rashi Chumash. Great. So the Rashi Chumash has, a lot of notes on the Rashi. The Rashi is like the definitive commentary on Scripture and Talmud, because he gets at the basic, simple meaning and brings in all kinds of sources. And it's like the most complete and the most studied and the most important commentary on everything. But like today, I didn't even know that when somebody cites the Gur Aryeh, that is the Maharal, Rabbi Judah Loew of Prague, his commentary on Rashi, right? So it's a commentary on a commentary. And if you saw the teaching that I shared today about Moses striking the rock, which was today's Torah reading, if every week has a Torah portion, you can divide the Torah portion into 7 aliyahs, and then you read one each day of the week. So today's Torah reading is about Moses striking the rock in anger after the death of his sister Miriam, when the whiners and complainers started swarming him again. I won't share that teaching now, but it's on the page at Accidental Talmudist, and it relies on the commentary of Rashi and on the Maharal's commentary on Rashi of this moment. Great. So that's what I've got. And Lynn says, thanks for mentioning the gray bar in the Art Scroll Talmud Bavli. I haven't even been paying attention to that. Now you see what page is translating what. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. It's great to be learning with you. And with God's help, I'll see you tomorrow when we continue with page 116